Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, David Bluvband joins us for A Night at the Opera.
Our guest today is an actor, writer, and filmmaker. You may have seen him in Mrs. Maisel, Hollywood, Kaleidoscope, and a show called Fallout. And, of course, The Chris Gethard Show, that's right. David Bluvband joins us today to talk about A Night at the Opera. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Groucho.
Thanks for coming here. I'm also going to just apologize for all of this because... Oh, God, I should have seen it coming. And yet, he keeps surprising me with the depths of how not funny it is. You know what? It makes sense that you're dating a Russian. The lack of humor just makes it such a perfect match made in heaven.
Every day is Ninochka for us. Every day.
God, I hate you.
How romantic.
That's right. So we are obviously here talking about A Night at the Opera. I'm going to swap this out for my actual glasses so I can see what's happening. All right.
There you go, buddy.
There we are. David, thank you so much for joining us on the show again. Thank you for, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, I believe this is your 5th time on the program.
I was counting that earlier. I was like, how many times have I been on this show? And I was like, oh, yeah. How many 5-timers have you had?
So, release order-wise, you are not the first.
Mm-hmm.
But recording order-wise, you are technically the first person we get to welcome to our 5
wow,
club.
Cool. Okay, sweet.
Our first Steve Martin, yes.
That's great. That's amazing. I'm the Steve Martin role. Cool. So now you need a Paul Simon. You need a Tom Hanks. And who else was in that sketch? Chevy? Was Chevy in there? Or was,
he is a 5-timer. I don't remember if he's in the original sketch or not. But I think so.
Lovitz plays the bellboy, and so does Conan O'Brien, and I think someone else. But that's you need to fill in the other slots. But that's great. I'm excited to get the jacket.
It's crazy, especially for me to think about that in terms of when we were first told to get in touch with you. I remember thinking, he's probably not going to want to do this stupid nonsense even once, and yet 5 times. Very cool.
I love it.
I
love talking about with you guys. You guys run a great show. And I love the movies that you've asked me to talk about. They've all been bangers.
Well,
is this the first comedy we've got him doing? Because hasn't it just straight up been like...
Well, no, Trouble in Paradise is a comedy.
Trouble in Paradise was a comedy, yeah.
Okay. I forget things.
It's worth noting, too, that obviously, David, we sent you a list of titles, and you picked A Night at the Opera, which is, I'll say it, the movie we always knew you were going to pick. There was never a time where we thought you were going to pick another movie, and there is definitely not an episode of this show where we very confidently predict what movie you will pick next season and are very wrong about.
That's good. I'm glad I'm very transparent in my taste.
No, there's definitely not. I'll just own it. In our season 4 finale, we're reading off all of the movies we're covering next season, and as we go down the list, I go, well, we're doing Touch of Evil, and Tom and I both confidently go, that's the David Bluvband movie. That's what David picks. Like, that's just the David. That's what he picks.
I remember that now. Yeah.
And so when you emailed me back and said, "Oh, Night at the Opera," I think my guy sent in the group chat just like in all caps, "Major swerve."
But see, that's why
that was the other one that stuck out to me. But I was like, I think because I was like, well, we did Night of the Hunter, which is like in that same like noir, not appreciated in its time type of vein. And I love Orson Welles. But yeah, I was like, I think when you sent the list initially, I had just watched The Night of the Opera.
Oh, really?
I had maybe back in November. I watch it like several times a year, but like usually around the end of the year is when I like kind of rack up a lot of old favorites for me, and that one that's one that's been a favorite of mine for a very long time.
So that's interesting because we have to right off the bat address for people listening to this who are not Marx Brothers aficionados.
Those that aren't retired.
Yes. For every, there is sort of amongst Marx Brothers fans sort of a divide, sort of a dividing line between the Paramount movies and the MGM movies.
Right.
And people tend to, you can like both, but it's like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Like, it's one of those where like everybody's got their kind of one with like, look, I enjoy them, but I lean more toward. So you saying Night at the Opera is a favorite of yours, and that being the first of the MGMs, right? So are you more of an MGM Marx guy or more of the earlier Paramount Marx?
I think it goes back and forth because I think what I like about I would say like in order, my favorites are Night of the Opera. That's my number one. Duck Soup is number two. And then three would have to be either like Animal Crackers or I stick up for A Night in Casablanca, like, because I didn't like that when I was a kid. I thought it was kind of boring. Now, as I'm older, I appreciate a lot of. That's a movie that has things a lot of Marx that no other Marx Brothers movie does, which is a true action set piece.
Yeah,
like that's Archie Mayo at the helm directing it, and he was also very adept at comedy. So I don't think I'm like a loyalist to any one particular era of Marx Brothers. I think I just like the thing I love about Night of the Opera is it's the one that feels the most like a movie to me.
Yeah. Tom,
and it's also the first one I saw. So I think that
okay. Well,
definitely like yeah.
Well,
Tom, what is?
I'm gonna presume you're Mike a Paramount. You said
Paramount. So they were with Paramount for the first batch of films. So everything from Coconuts through to Duck Soup, and then.
So I'm gonna presume you're more of a Paramount era Marx Brothers guy, based on the tenor of the way you asked the question.
As an adult, yes. As a kid, I much preferred like Day at the Races and Night at the Opera, and those because the big difference is that because I was going to say, Tom, I know you were not like you didn't grow up with Marx Brothers or anything like that.
No.
So what is your kind of understanding of what changed from Paramount to MGM?
Basically, the understanding on my end is that they basically had to make quote unquote real movies, and that's why there's like a love story, and the visual style is a little more cinematic, and it's not. It doesn't feel like they kind of just ran into a room, filmed it, did some vaudeville bits, and then like slapped it together in editing later. Not a dismissal of the movies at all, but it's just you look at it technically, you look at it clear-eyed. There is, because I haven't seen all of the Marx Brothers movies. It's still a blind spot where I still am looking very, like, I need to watch all of them the way I did all of the Abbott and Costello movies, which was a much bigger endeavor. I enjoyed every single second of it, but still, I have the Paramount box set they put out. I need to get I need to get the Blu-rays, whatever exists of the MGM era for the Marx boys. But yeah, so from the few I've seen Paramount-wise, they were much more rickety. I mean, they're definitely, because they're earlier in the sound era, so it's still a little bit of that, like, we're kind of figuring things out sort of thing, especially for them. Right. What's a Marx Brothers movie? Blah, blah, blah. They get to MGM. They don't really have as much control. It's still Marx Brothers movies, but it's like you got to have singing. Zeppo's not here. Blah, blah, blah. Love story. So it's funny because as much as I just genuinely did not give a shit about the love story stuff, the non-Marx Brothers stuff in this movie, this is thus far my favorite Marx Brothers movie. This one was the one that had me laughing the hardest at
Yeah.
everything they did. I felt like this was really, if you just trimmed out all of that love story stuff, it would be a nice, like, 70-minute fucking just, oh, we
Sure.
get the basic
Yeah.
idea. These guys are pulling some schemes to get involved in the opera. They get screwed over, so they screw over the opera. Great. Awesome. I don't need anything else. But, whatever, you deal with it. And I was cackling, man. I watched it
Yeah.
early this morning, right after breakfast, and I was just like, "This is just hitting the spot, man." I was really so into this.
I think, when I said, like, as an adult I prefer the Paramount, I think part of that is that when I was watching the Paramount stuff, when I tried to watch the Paramount stuff as a kid compared to the MGM stuff, when you're a child, you're starting to understand, like, what movies are quote unquote supposed to be, right?
Yes.
And when you watch those early kind of scrappy Paramount movies, especially Duck Soup, like, they're so anarchic, your brain just goes, movies aren't supposed to do this.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
and so you go to the MGM stuff because it's more formal. It's no different than, like, when you watch some of the earlier Laurel and Hardy shorts that are more anarchic, and then you watch Babes in Toyland, or I'm sorry, March of the Wooden Soldiers, right? You watch March of the Wooden Soldiers, or one of those where they're the comic sidekicks and there's main characters. And as a child, you go, yes, this is what a movie's supposed to be. And then as an adult, when I'm watching those Paramount Marx Brothers movies, it's the same response where I'm like, oh, this isn't what movies are supposed to do. But now it's thrilling, right? But, the Night at the Opera is this first shift where Thalberg gets involved because the Marx were kind of worn out of Paramount. Duck Soup didn't perform well. I'll ask this because I know this is going to make you happy. Tom, do you know how the Marx Brothers came to get involved with MGM?
No.
Degenerate gambler Chico Marx
Well, I
was
knew he
playing
was a degenerate gambler.
was
Yeah.
playing a shit ton of high stakes card games with Irving Thalberg.
Loving it already.
And over one of these games, Chico was lamenting their troubles, and Thalberg told him, "You should come to MGM. I know what's wrong with the Marx Brothers and their movies." And Chico was like, "Okay, what's wrong with the Marx Brothers and their movies?" He goes, "You got too many jokes. It's too much of that. I can make you twice the money for doing half the jokes." And so Chico was like,
yeah. It's a very Irving Thalberg way of approaching how to make, like, because I was watching this on the Criterion Channel. There's that Buster Keaton documentary that Peter Bogdanovich,
the Great Buster.
Yeah. And in it, he mentions that Keaton's move to MGM was disastrous for his career. And then he referenced that MGM, their weak spot was comedy at that point, like in that era of their existence. Because he listed Laurel and Hardy, Buster Keaton, another comedy act that escapes me, Marx Brothers, that they all made their worst films for MGM. But I stand by the idea that I think Night at the Opera is their best film, because I think the gags in it are really funnier than most of the other gags from their other movies. And I think, like, because I'm also like like you, Tom, I haven't seen all the Marx Brothers movies. There's two. In fact, I last year was the first time I had ever seen Horse Feathers, which I thought is insane. It's like the horniest of all of their movies, and it's like really weird. And it also reminds you of the idea that, like, oh yeah, comedies about college were super popular at that time. So there's like a bunch of just college movies, and it's its own little subgenre, but it's so, but I still haven't seen the one with Marilyn Monroe. Love Happy, is that what it's called?
Yeah, I think so.
And I think that's whatever their last one was. And I haven't seen Go West either. Those are the two I haven't seen yet.
They all bleed together so much that I was watching a clip of Groucho on the Dick Cavett show.
Yeah, I've seen. Yeah,
which I texted it to Tom, but God bless it. Gilbert Gottfried's impression of Groucho on the Dick Cavett show remains one of the funniest niche things.
That's like a pop culture staple at this point. That that interview itself.
Back then, we used to drink coffee, which was a liquid, which was hot. So anyway, Groucho's on Dick Cavett, and Groucho doesn't even remember what these fucking movies are called, because he's going like Lydia the Tattooed Lady. That we did that in a picture called A Day at the Circus. No, it wasn't. No, that
Groucho
was not
Groucho has a contemptuous relationship with reporters and interviewers throughout his entire career and life, where he gives like, I compare it to like when Adam Pally is on interview circuits for whatever he's promoting, like, and he gives sort of fake bit answers to things because he genuinely just doesn't want to be there and thinks the whole process is stupid and beneath him. Like, to me, I'm like, that's what Groucho is. He's grouchy. He's sardonic and he's cynical and he's very like over it. And he's maybe one of the worst initial instincts of any of the brothers. Because he generally hates everything that they're doing in the moment that when it's happening, and it's like, it's clearly like that the other brothers were a little bit more. They saw the bigger picture a little bit better, where it seems like Groucho is just consistently just like never thought stuff was going to work, and then it did.
It's crazy. So for anybody who hasn't seen it, seek out this clip of Groucho on Dick Cavett performing Lydia the Tattooed Lady.
Right.
Because I put it on and my sense of timeline was broken in two different ways. Because this is one of those times where like Groucho sounds and looks like he is about to die when he's doing this. Sure. And yet, as I'm watching it, I'm like, in this clip, he's the same age as Steve Martin is right now.
Yeah. I've thought about that too. Right. I'm just like, yeah, shit. Yeah, that's right. He's that age now, which is crazy to me.
And obviously Steve Martin is doing a streaming show where he has to run around and Groucho is this. But the other sense of timeline that threw me off radically was here's Groucho on the Dick Cavett show, right? Groucho on the Dick Cavett show having to talk about George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. And it feels like him then doing Lydia the Tattooed Lady, you're like, well, that was from a century ago.
Right.
No. 30 years. 30 years from when Lydia the Tattooed Lady played in At the Circus to that Dick Cavett interview. Yeah. So for context, if you watch that Dick Cavett clip, it's the same thing as if Steve Martin was on The Tonight Show and they said, hey, can you do a bit from Father of the Bride 2? Like, that's the gap there, which is just truly mind-boggling to think about. The idea that it was only 30 years distance.
Yeah.
From
and the reference had probably grown forgotten then, as Father of the Bride is forgotten by like millennials now, like for anyone younger, of just like, oh, this doesn't mean anything to them.
Well, at that point, though, it had come back because it was doing the college circuit, those films.
Right.
Because a lot of those, we talked about it on our W.C. Fields Bank Dick episode, but like Marx Brothers, W.C. Fields, those films were getting shipped out to colleges because all the stoned college kids were like...
Right. They'd become embraced by the counterculture. Yeah. I've been recently trying to go through a lot of my classic comedy cavalcade blind spots that were like, because I grew up like with Marx Brothers from an early age, but I didn't watch Three Stooges until very recently. I didn't watch W.C. Fields until relatively recently. I've never seen a Laurel and Hardy movie to date yet. I still have not. I haven't like gone down that rabbit hole yet. There's lots of stuff. I always I still get, I guess, just because I was exposed to them first, I still think like Marx Brothers to me is the pinnacle of that era of comedy. Buster Keaton, also same thing. I only just recently started to appreciate him and have gone through a lot of his filmography, and now I love him more than I did Chaplin, whom I also like grew up with more.
Sorry, Tom. I think I cut you off there. Were you starting to say about?
No, yeah, I was just gonna. It's you bring up Groucho being an old man on Cavett, and you compare it to like Steve Martin and whatnot 30 years ago. It just made me think about how weird the Hollywood and the industry and all that was back then, where those comedy guys, they had their moments, and then
Mm.
once they were done, they were just gone until they had those moments where they got resurrected, and you bring, because you think about like Abbott and Costello dominated in their era until they petered off, and then they split up and really did nothing.
Yeah.
Costello died young. Bud lived basically an isolated life because he was sick. Think of Laurel and
Mm.
Hardy. Once they broke, like what happened? The Stooges. They disappeared.
Yeah.
Charlie Chaplin. He maybe had the longest tail after his heyday, so to
He
speak.
had a
But
couple of resurrected, career moments, but yeah, you're right. Most of them
it's
like really had their like,
Well,
yeah,
but that's the
and
interesting
you
thing about Groucho, is that he didn't disappear.
right, because he had a
He
game
had
show
he
later.
had You Bet Your Life. So in a weird way, Groucho having that moment on Dick Cavett where they recognize the Marx Brothers films would be more akin to if you tried to explain to a Gen Z kid, if you tried to explain to them, you go, so Whoopi Goldberg was one of our great comedians. They would go,
Yeah,
that's the lady from The View. What do you
right,
mean?
yeah,
And you'd have to be like,
mhm,
she has an Oscar and
yeah.
arguably should have two. And they'd be like,
She's
no,
had like
that's the lady
multiple.
from The View.
She had
You know?
multiple comedy specials that made
Yeah.
her like super famous. She was like the lead of several. Like she led several movies,
Yeah.
several really like broad comedy, Marx Brothers esque situational movies,
So it would
like
be
The Associate.
so it would be like if all of a sudden, like, the TikTok crowd just started going, have you guys heard of this thing called Sister Act?
Yeah,
That's sort of the thing that was happening to Groucho in the 60s, is like he was on television, but by that point, or even depending on how you feel about You Bet Your Life, I mean, he had some good zingers on that, but it was probably a mix of that and also kind of like when you talk to like our parents and they go, Jay Leno's stand-up used to kill.
yes, yeah.
And they'd be like,
Jay Leno
really
used to
though?
be like the
Yeah.
comedian's comedian, and like when you like, which is very hard for me to believe, but no, you're right, Mike. It's a very similar um, comparison.
it's just funny because yes, Groucho had that moment, but you at least look at the era now. There's still more guys from like the original SNL run that are still like guys today. There's still,
Sure.
Sandler and his crew are still making stuff. Eddie Murphy, when he pops out of his bubble, is still, people talk about him and he makes stuff. It's, yeah, Whoopi's fallen into that Groucho hole of like being a big star and then quickly devolving into almost a punchline, and then is now
Yeah,
just in the talk show,
she's
vortex.
become like
Um,
less of like a comedian and more just of a TV personality.
she's just a personality that, not to put it this way, but whatever, riding the coattails of her past glories of being the biggest
Sure.
comedian, one of the biggest comedians of the 80s, and getting an Oscar like right at the first crack of the bat. Um, it's just, yeah, I just in general, it just made me think about how the comedy world and like just in general, like it's so different from back then, where
Oh yeah,
once you were done, there was no more room for you, and unless you were very lucky, you could get a Groucho TV show hosting gig, and then hope and pray that a bunch of drunken schmucks in college decide you're funny, even though your heyday was 30 years before they were born or whatever. So
right.
like, it's just interesting to me how that all that stuff sort of played out, big
Yeah.
picture
Well,
sort of thing.
they came up in a time when there were just so little outlets for
Yeah.
entertainment. I mean, like if you want, like you really like track the Marx Brothers, like in their own lifetime, the business of show business changed, and the landscape of comedy and performance changed, where they come from, vaudeville, and like I think the first time they put on a show like that, the Marx Brothers form as an act was like 1900,
Mm-hmm.
and then like and there's no like movie outlet there. There's not even really like a straight theater outlet from there. Vaudeville was seen as a very low class and art form, and they're in disreputable venues, and everything's like undercover, like they're doing all these shows and like hustling and hoofing to like another city so they can get like all like it, and then like as they keep doing it, the business evolves, and suddenly like vaudeville acts in the teens, in the aughts, in the early 20s start getting bigger stage opportunities. They start like then they go to Broadway. They meet guys like George Kaufman, who I think knew the Marx Brothers from childhood, because he's also a New York guy.
And it's so interesting you mentioned vaudeville, because one of the things I think of, and then we'll get into the film itself, but one of the things I think of with the Marx Brothers in particular that makes them stand out is there are so many acts who had their origins in vaudeville, where when they make the leap to film, they're still explicitly vaudeville. The one I think of a lot is Jimmy Durante. Like,
oh God, yeah, totally.
Like almost any Jimmy Durante movie has one or two scenes where he goes, "Let me tell you how things were in the vaudeville days," and then he does his vaudeville act. Whereas the Marx Brothers, their stuff stands the test of time better. They're able to make that transition better, because even though the material they're doing came from their stage shows, they don't make it feel like a stage show. Arguably Coconuts does. I'm not going to say that.
Coconuts is a very like that's almost like avant-garde, how like this, like not quite in a Duck Soup disjointed way, which I think you can make the argument that Duck Soup is like an art house film with its lack of structure. But Coconuts has like, they're still trying to figure the form out. It's a little slower paced. You have Kay Francis in it, which is funny that's like sort of her jumping off point from our Trouble in Paradise conversation. Like this was before she was as like the biggest star of the 20s at that, or the 30s at that time. Like this was her in a small supporting role was her launching off point in a Marx Brothers movie.
Well, there's one anecdote about that in the stage work and how that applies, but I want to get into that in a second. First, I want to make sure we kick this off properly. So before we talk any more about A Night at the Opera, let's hear what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry says about A Night at the Opera.
A Night at the Opera. When the Marx Brothers moved to MGM, director Sam Wood was tasked by studio exec Irving Thalberg to rein in the anarchy the brothers had perpetrated at Paramount. No longer the focal point of the picture, they served as comic relief to the musical romance between Kitty Carlisle and Alan Jones. As the business-savvy Thalberg might have predicted, the film was the highest-grossing of all the Marx Brothers comedies, but also signaled their artistic decline. Though no longer at the reins, they still delivered plenty of frenetic fun, as evidenced by the hilarious stateroom scene, and subjected Margaret Dumont and Sig Ruman to endless indemnities.
The reason I wanted to set that up for this anecdote is even that registry statement says, well, this is their highest grossing, but it signaled the start of an artistic decline. Night at the Opera is unique because it is a case where, part of the production of this a lot of their earlier material had come from their stage shows.
Right.
And when they weren't sure if this was going to work, Thalberg went so far as to say, fine, let's take all of the comedy bits, the stateroom scene, the contract scene, all that. Let's take them all, take them out on the road, do them on stage. We will have people in the audience to time how long you need to pause to allow for laughter in the movie. We'll take notes of what works and what doesn't. And that's interesting in and of itself. But the reason I brought that up in that moment is that the other thing that Thalberg does that is so good for the Marx Brothers in this is so the stateroom scene, which is maybe the most famous bit of physical comedy the Marx Brothers have ever done. Whenever they performed it on stage, no matter what tweaks they made, the bit died. It didn't play. And so the Marx Brothers were like, well, let's cut it. And Thalberg was the one who said, no, it's gonna work because you don't have a camera on stage. Mm-hmm. On stage, they see that the walls of the room, the stateroom, are just flats. So everybody cramming into this room. Yeah. Everybody cramming into this room isn't funny.
It's such a, that's one of those things where you really appreciate Thalberg's input and you're like, oh, this guy's got he's actually got an eye for this, because he's right. When I can absolutely seeing that scene tanking on stage because the illusion is immediately broken, and it's just like that. That's kind of it's one of those things where it's so many of the Marx Brothers bits and jokes can be interchangeable from movie to movie. But I think what appeals to me about Night of the Opera is its cinematic quality to it, how it's so unmistakably it's almost transplantedly. Is that a word? It's just not it's so a movie. It's just not a stage production. Yeah. It's just so it's got bits that really feed into the cinematic quality of their senses of humor. Even just Harpo climbing up the rope from the galley into the ship and how they do it's not sped up, it's drop framing, which I just learned from Leonard Maltin. Where it looks like super speed. It's also when Harpo's walking down the spiral staircase. Mm-hmm. They just remove seconds of footage from the physical piece of film, in between each frame. So it's even more complicated, and it's more work. But it's so effective, and it's so funny and interesting looking. And it makes them all seem in their costumes already make them feel like they are not of this world. They're almost they're living cartoon characters almost.
Yeah. It's to touch on it a bit more with the Thalberg of it all. Groucho was quoted as saying, "We only made 2 truly great movies, and they were the ones that Thalberg did." Mm-hmm. And you can, Day at the Races is a little rougher because, if for nothing else, I would say Day at the Races is rougher because as silly as this sounds, you don't really think about it, but the music isn't as good in Day at the Races.
Music isn't, well, there's also, there's a couple of moments in Day at the Races that hold up far less than other parts of other movies. Even though they are parts that I think are interesting, especially for the time, but it's also it's not one you'd recommend. There's when they go to the when they sing the Horn of Gabriel song in Day at the Races, it's a little it's not offensive, but it is just a very dated scene, and it doesn't hit as hard as Cosi Cosa, which is just completely celebratory, and I remember just watching that as a kid and being and another thing, when kids watch old movies, there's this, like you said, Mike, there's you kind of, when you're a kid, you're I think I understand how movies work and how they operate, and then when you see a comedy that also has these beautiful musical set pieces that you don't see in like Tommy Boy
Yeah.
or like Billy Madison.
I fucking wish, to be clear.
I know, like I think Tommy Boy is like a nearly perfect. It's like 100% movie for me, but like it's one of my favorite comedies of all time. But I think it would be like 150 if they had like a coast level
Well,
musical number.
I mean, in fairness,
Just
the other example that you listed as you don't see that in, technically you do, because you just said Billy Madison, and one of the high points of Billy Madison is that
right, there is a musical part
toward
of
the
that,
end
yeah.
of the movie, not only is
It
there a
goes back
musical
to
number,
school.
but they are singing like characters in old. Because one of the things I love when you watch like old Disney movies, and I'm talking like Snow White era Disney movies or Warner Brothers films or like this, is that people in the 1930s sing like no one ever sings before or after. They have
Right.
vowed alone when I'm
Alone.
and it's like nobody. And again, you watch Snow White, and like there's the prince and the Snow White, and it's just today, and it's just no one sounds like that. And when you watch Billy Madison, that is the way that
you're right. When he's like, "Yes, I will go back to school." Yeah, it's very.
I mean, that is, and I mean that's kind of one of the key things that we are going to touch on. I think a lot in this conversation is that like because the Marx Brothers are in the DNA of so many comedians, and I think especially Night at the Opera and Duck Soup, but like Night at the Opera in particular feels like everyone from Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks to Adam Sandler to Robert Smigel to Conan O'Brien, they can all remember Night at the Opera.
Well, because isn't this like maybe I wouldn't say the first, but this almost feels like we talk about like how cinema's not always about being first. It's just about doing it the best first. And this almost feels like the first great snobs versus slobs movie.
I was gonna say this is an original slobs versus snobs movie, and it's probably also like the one that might have been played on TV the most when it was. I
wouldn't be surprised about that. Yeah. But yeah, like this is basically the blueprint of most. I'll say lowbrow comedy, since we're not going to say like Woody Allen or Albert Brooks were making movies like this or what have you, but like this is every Mel Brooks movie, every SNL movie, every Sandler movie, every Seth Rogen movie. This is just like this is every Danny McBride thing. This is like every gross out lowbrow quote unquote comedy that's come after it, more than more than Abbott and Costello or Three Stooges or Charlie Chaplin or whatever. Like this is maybe the moment where like the next 100 years essentially of comedy is basically etched in stone and then brought down from on high, which just makes me want to point out before I forget, this has like I wasn't expected to get so unexpectedly touched by a scene in this movie, but I was genuinely touched by the scene of them on the boat performing, and all of the Italian peasants are like really into it, and like it's kind of almost a commentary of them saying like, well, you stuffy shirts might think we're just a bunch of degenerate freaks who make lowbrow nonsense, that we don't make art, but you know what? We make the people that are on the bottom of the ship, that don't get all the high class treatment, that fuel this country, we make them happy. So at the end of the day, we're glad we're making these guys happy, and we're going to spend the rest of our time making your lives a living hell. I thought that was unexpected. Like I was not expecting an unexpectedly emotional sort of like thematically rich moment from this movie, and I was like, I really kind of like that moment.
Same. That's one of my it's my favorite moment too, Tom. It's a very touching, and it's just very, you get that they're like, I love that there's like so many moments of this movie where I memorize every frame of it. Like there's like that sequence on the in the ship, the people that work on the ship in the peasants' quarters, the Italian peasants there, and they're all singing, and like Harpo just like looks at the spaghetti before he's even like offered a plate. He's just like,
Yeah.
and then he's like, he takes it and he's just like, oh my god, they're giving it to me. I'm like, I got it, and they're just eating it. And oh, before I forget, I wanted to just piggyback on what you were saying earlier, Tom, about like how the love story sections don't really work in like, but which I agree, that's always been boring for me as well. But I think what works, what you there's something, it's a dynamic that's necessary in these movies, and this is my favorite one of these, which most of the Marx Brothers movies, save for like Duck Soup or some of the earlier ones, have like these arbitrary, kind of quote unquote normal people scenes, like the more grounded characters. And I think like what makes this one work the best is, especially Alan Jones, they all look like kind of, if they weren't in a Marx Brothers movie, I would have no idea who they were. Like they are just kind of like, Alan Jones is like this kind of like handsome McActor guy, like ha 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 ha. These sure are swashbuckling times, old chum type of actor. And he's very like, they're almost like color palettes where it's just like, okay, well, this guy's red, this chick's blue. They're gonna fit where they're gonna fit, and they play their parts very, very well without like domineering the scene and being too noticeable. Mm-hmm. Like they're just like, oh well, yeah, I'm just serving this part of the scene. And fun fact, I learned this when I was doing my research this morning. Like Alan Jones's son is also a singer, or was. He just passed away recently, but Jack Jones sang the theme song for The Love Boat.
Really?
Yeah. The Love Boat.
Which honestly is, can I say, pretty close to that style of singing if you think about it.
Exactly.
We were talking. It's not that far. We very close to love, exciting, and knew we could have had it.
It's that old timey like this is how you have to sing for radio because you got to make your voice like higher pitched, like because the frequency won't pick it up otherwise.
And it's like, I think what you're saying about the I almost called them the human characters.
I know, like that's what it feels like, yeah.
Honestly, let's be real. That Tom, you saying I don't care for the love story, whatever. I feel like we have to argue against that the same way that like you and I argue with people about Godzilla movies, where it's like, no, It can't just be the kaiju. You need to have the human characters for a couple scenes to ground it. The one thing I will say about their performance, because you're right, David, these kind of straight man characters, these human characters exist in a lot of them, but having just had Animal Crackers on a little while ago, and remembering that like the plot line of the human characters in that are like, well, you want to be a great painter, but nobody takes you seriously. What if you swap your painting for this paint? In this, number one, it's simple to understand because it's a story of class, right? Boy falls in love with girl, but she's got the fancier guy, right?
And the fancier guy's a dick, like an obvious bad guy.
A rich dick.
Isn't it so funny how this structure is essentially just Phantom of the Opera, but they are the Phantoms?
Funny enough, I was gonna say Titanic.
Well, Titanic,
but Titanic, but I was also gonna. It's that same like dynamic of like there are these because opera is also I feel like such a trope of characters too, because you also can't just have Margaret Dumont and Sig Rumen as the because they're big characters too.
It's like, hey, we found this really talented opera singer that is so good, but is just not going to get the opportunities. Well, here come these three absolute inhumane cartoon character maniacs that are going to destroy everything and thus give the poor guy the opportunity. Instead of being a deformed freak haunting the place, it's three shitheels just committing some schemes and insulting everybody and, maybe, committing some light fraud.
The other thing I'll say in favor of the human characters, though, too, that's worth noting is Alan Jones and Kitty Carlisle really get how to play this. The human characters in some of the other Marx Brothers films are very broad, right?
Well,
and
yeah.
I'm like specifically in the moment of there's a great human moment when Groucho, they're all at the dinner, right? And Groucho has that line about like, well, there's only, the only tenor I had any patience for is named Riccardo Bellini. And she and Kitty Carlisle, any other one of these actors they had would have just gone, oh, Riccardo. But she delivers that as though she was in a romantic drama. There's a very sincere sigh of Riccardo where you believe it, and I think that helps because you have to be somewhat endeared to these characters, even if you don't care about like their romance. You have to be somewhat endeared because it gives you something to cheer for when the Marx Brothers are fucking with these people, not just laughing.
Well, listen,
they're in their own movie. They're in their own, like, if it wasn't a Marx Brothers movie, it would be a very boring melodrama.
Well, I will say that this, it's funny that this is like pretty much deeper into the career than you would think, because this feels, at least structurally, not overall and how the movie shot and whatnot, it feels like those early Abbott and Costello movies where it wasn't really an Abbott and Costello. It almost felt like they did just shove Abbott and Costello into another movie until a few movies in where they just became Abbott and Costello movies. This is better than like those examples. This is better than, oh, well, we got these guys from vaudeville. They're not real, they're kind of green. Let's put them in one of our B pictures and for a few scenes and see how. It's like, no, this is still, like Mike says, they feel like they're not playing to the Marx Brothers. They're playing to the movie they're in. The Marx Brothers just happen to be running around, almost like Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Lugosi and all the monsters are playing it like we're in a monster movie. We're not going to yuck it up. Lon Chaney Jr. is very clearly on the edge of suicide the entire movie. He's not yucking it up like, hey, I'm the Wolfman, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I'm a goddamn Wolfman. I'm going to fucking kill myself, but I got to stop Dracula before he does anything. God damn it. And you're like, what the fuck, bro? Like, Abbott, like, you're standing next to Lou Costello. Relax. This is definitely a better example of that. And I agree with what you're saying that you kind of need it, but counterpoint, I don't like it. So I say, nanner, go fuck yourself.
It's worth noting that Tom is 99% a very thoughtful and insightful film fan, and 1% the little boy from Princess Bride.
Sure.
So, like, every once in a while, his note will just be, Grandpa, is there kissing in this movie? I don't want to watch a kissing movie.
Well, no, because freaking you got Groucho's doing his one-liners, Chico being just a guinea fuck, such a guinea little bastard, and then you got Harpo just doing his cartoonish stuff, which also, I know this is a me thing, his hair freaks me out. I'm sorry, something about his hair just like skeeves me the fuck out.
Well,
it's
Tom,
very weird. It's a pink wig, weirdly enough. But a lot of people think it's blonde, but it's a pink wig apparently.
Well, that's why, and that's why Walt Disney was the genius that he was, because he was like, well, we're just going to blatantly rip off Harpo for Dopey, but shave his head. That's the problem.
Shave
his head. Fuck, that makes sense.
Yeah. That's when you watch the Marx Brothers now, it's very easy to, like, anytime Harpo's on screen, you go, that's Dopey. Anytime Groucho's on screen, you go, that's Bugs Bunny. And anytime Chico's on screen, you go, that's what people used to think that my ancestors were like.
That is what our ancestors. Let's be real. I was even thinking about this watching the movie, and it just brought up an old conversation. Do you remember, Mike, the episode of Podcast Like It's 99 where they did Analyze This, and they spent the whole movie, the whole episode basically saying, oh, well, this is just so, like, Italians couldn't like this. This is so bad for Italians. And I'm just sitting there listening to it. I'm just like, no, Italians love this shit.
Yeah.
We love every stereotypical, Goomba, cartoonish, guinea ass thing that a movie can throw at you. They'll be like, "Oh, that's so funny. That's like my Uncle Al. That's like
Well,
this
it's like
one and that one."
I forget what episode I said it on, but it was just
We
like
love that we're lowlives. It's so funny. Italians are so funny.
But it's like I said it on. I forget what episode I said it on, but it's like, so many of us like thought that our uncles and grandfathers were the funniest people on the planet because they memorized jokes from Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields movies, and that's all. And like my grandpa in particular, like had a pocket full of Chico ripoffs ready to go at any time because that accent. And I think part of what makes Chico work so well too, as opposed to a lot of other ethnic humor from that time that hasn't aged as well, is that, as has been pointed out, and Leonard Maltin, I think, described it as the worst Italian accent anyone has ever had. And so when you're a little child watching these, you don't even know he's supposed to be Italian, both because the accent is bad and because he's spoofing or he's playing on an Italian stereotype that by the time we're children is gone. The Italian stereotypes that we grew up with are, like Tom says, analyze this, right? Whereas the shifty, lazy gondolier type is not how we're stereotyping Italians. So Chico just comes off as a weird guy, in the 90s.
If you look at Chico interviews from later in his life, I think he kind of fell into an Austin Butler situation where he couldn't get out of the voice after that. So he's just like always talking like that now. Or like towards the end of his life where it's just like, yeah, they call me Chico because I'm the chicken chaser. Oh, I still chase him. I don't catch him anymore. And just like all these, he's like, it's obviously like it's still the affectation. He's doing it because he's being interviewed. But it's like, it does feel after a while like when you get into doing a bit all the time, that's just what your life is.
But now. That's also the reality, and let's just own it. I think we can all say it here. That's also just the reality of old Italians and old Jews just age into one nebulous energy.
Same type of person.
Where it's like, it's distinct for a while, but after you crack 70, you're like, I don't know how, but you all find the same accent. I don't know.
Well, it's part of the contract. Jews can play Italian.
We can play each other on film.
Jews.
Yeah.
Right. It's a spoken agreement. The
only thing is that not going to disagree with Mike about why Chico works and isn't offensive, but I just have to say Italians are the only group that are okay with offensive stereotypes about themselves. It's like the amount, like the fact that no Italians ever get offended by The Godfather or The Sopranos. They go, oh, that's just like our family. And you have to go like, you don't see a problem with that? and it's like, no, we love it.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Tom. This feels like an appropriate time to bring up this point. Let's talk about the offensive Italian content that was cut out of this movie.
Right. I just learned this morning because of because this was right when Mussolini had like taken over and made Italy like a fascist government. They were like really iffy about like showing any of the Italian depictions in the movie as like being as worried they would make the movie seem pro Italy at that time. So they like there's like I apparently the movie's supposed to open, and this was lost on me as a kid. The movie opens in Italy.
Yeah.
And then they're on the ship going to America for the opera house to New York. And as a kid, that was lost on me. And I apologize if this was going to be what you were going to share, Mike. But this was like the thing of like the movie was supposed to open with like an Italian. Is it like an organ grinder or like a street sweeper, some sort of like worker or like street person of that ilk, like singing opera, and then into Alan Jones singing the same song.
Actually, it was supposed to be more than that.
Okay.
So the scene that we were supposed to get was it would open with a title card that says Italy, where they sing all day and go to the opera at night, right? And it would begin with the street sweeper singing Pagliacci, right? I don't know which. I'm assuming the same Pagliacci number that Groucho sings throughout the film. And what we would have seen is it would have gone from person to person throughout Italy. So the street sweeper, and then after the street sweeper, he passes by like a ticket seller, and now the ticket seller is singing. And then he passes by children, and now children are singing. And it's like we're seeing Italy. And the reason I wanted to bring that up, beyond just the fact that this is a really interesting opening number that they've cut out, and it would have made its way through to the hotel, to the lobby, right? And it would actually have ended on the waiter who we see encounter Groucho and Margaret Dumont.
The first line of the movie.
Yeah.
The first line of the movie is now, with all that stuff cut out, is "He's still not here, ma'am." To Margaret.
Right.
And then that is, and by the way, that sequence that you described is the most Sam Wood sequence.
Well, it's also,
that is where you can tell that is, because that was his signature type of thing to do in his other movies. Like The Devil and Miss Jones has sort of where you hear about Mr. Merrick, nobody's ever seen him before. It's just all these different things.
But it's even more directly ripping off something else. And I'm going to say this is a big test. Tom, the scene we just described is explicitly ripping off a different movie we covered on this podcast. Do you remember what that is?
Love Me Tonight.
Correct.
Oh,
that scene is an explicit ripoff of the opening of Love Me Tonight, the Maurice Chevalier movie, except that takes place in Paris. So much so that when I was watching the film, watching the Blu-ray with Leonard Maltin's commentary, and he's describing the scene, in my head, I was just like, wait, I've seen that. I've seen that scene. It's like, no, that's the Love Me Tonight opening.
That's funny.
And I think they cut it because it kind of feels like, and I'm not going to try and get too topical on this. I'm going to be vague about this in a lot of ways because who knows who's auditioning for what or working for what company. But let's just say we are all aware, and we're not going to say anything specific, there is a major blockbuster that shot a lot of scenes, that touched on some geopolitical things, that keeps going, oh shit, oh fuck, let's re-edit this and test screen it and re-edit this and test screen it so that we can just maybe see, can we get around the fact that major set pieces and characters are involved with certain nationalities that weren't as big a deal when we started this, and now, oh boy. I kept thinking of that when I'm reading about all of the times where, halfway through the shooting script, they changed one of the characters. I'm forgetting the actor's name now. The Sig. Why am I forgetting his last name?
Sig Ruman.
Sig Ruman. His character, I believe, in the shooting script, halfway through the shooting script, he had an Italian name, and then they change it because they were like, we can't call him that. No, don't do it. Just get it all out of there. And it's so fun. It's it's wild to think about that happening while this movie is in production.
It's also funny. It's also funny that you bring up the movie that shouldn't be named because if you look deep, there's also a deleted scene in Day at the Night at the Opera that's set at
beep this.
That's set at the
I'm gonna have to.
It's just a and you go, wow, Groucho's making a lot of this. He's making some real good comedic beats out of this. It's a shame that we're gonna have to cut this because, well, politics, man.
I'd offer to give you a hand, but it sounds like you've got that covered.
Heyo. It's so funny that the character that can't be named is in the trailer, and it's just doing the accent, and you're like, oh, they didn't fix this at all.
We are moving on. I shouldn't have brought it up. I shouldn't have. I dangled a steak in front of Tom, and he bit. That's on me.
Yeah.
I'm blaming myself.
What are you doing?
Well, can I ask you, gentlemen, have you ever, since we're talking about funny voices and accents in general, Have you guys ever listened to Harpo Marx's autobiography that he narrates himself? Harpo Speaks.
No,
No.
no.
It's
Okay.
fascinating. You
Yeah.
can listen to it. You can listen to it at the I found it on Canopy.
Mhm.
Like you can listen to it in the library or the the many different audio files you can listen to it at your local library. I'm sure they might have it. And he Arthur is it Arthur Marx is his name?
I believe.
He changed it famously. He is born as Adolf Marx, and then changed it in the mid-teens because it probably had. I don't think it has as much to do with Hitler as people think. I think he sounded lame. Like at the time, he was just like, "This kind of sucks."
I would love if it was because he was like, listen, I don't want to have something too German sounding because of the Kaiser, and somebody went, hey, buddy, it's going to get worse.
It's going to be way worse than that.
You got in on the ground floor of changing your name from Adolf. You got that out of the way quick.
But he sounds the most New York, like the most Hamilton Heights area. You know, they're from the upper part of the island of Manhattan, like closer to Yonkers and the Bronx. And they have the most turn of the century New York accent you could ever hear. Like the type of New York accent where they switch the oys and the r sounds interchangeably. So turlet's toilet, toilet is turlet, and tuberculosis is tuberculosis. And he said, or hamburgy is one thing he says instead of hamburger. I remember from the audiobook as well, from his narration as well. He says hamburgies and Earl for oil, and he just talk and it's just him talking about his life and the careers of him and his brothers. It's truly fascinating. I think he was I think he was the most fascinating of all the brothers.
I say bring the accent back. I think we need to bring that back into the culture.
I'll give it a shot. I'll do my best bet.
These days I'm partway there. The older I get, the more I slip into just like that sort of affectation of just like, you know what? This is the kind of guy I am now. This is how I feel. This is how I feel inside.
Well, Mike can attest. I'm sure I sound New York as I'm talking now. I don't hear it, but even I start noticing how New York I get when I get mad, and I just start screaming like a Goomba from the. I'm yelling like somebody just told me to go get my fucking shine box. That's basically, and I'm just like, oh man, no matter how hard. Not that I'm trying, but no matter how old I get, that shit is just never gonna leave me.
It lives in you. That is one thing. All of us have like a New Yorker somewhere in the pit of our stomach, because I don't have an accent. I've been told that my whole life. It would be so funny because David, you've heard Tom and I speak a very long time. Anytime we would go out, anytime we'd run into people, and they would go like, "Oh, so you guys like." And we'd say we met in college, and they'd be like, "Oh, so you guys came from like totally different places?" And we're like, "We live 10 minutes from each other." And yet you could basically describe us as, Raging Bull and ordinary people. That's kind of our vibes.
Sure. He lived in the more Italian neighborhood than I did.
Yeah.
And he's the one who sounds like he fucking comes from Connecticut.
Right. You would assume, you look at me and go, that guy's from Levittown. You would think that, just the energy, and yet, but the reason I say that is even me, like there is a thing where at a certain point something turns around, and whether I'm driving or I'm just in an argument with somebody, and that other voice just it does kind of pop up sometimes. That the accent comes in. I think we should, we have been talking about the Marx Brothers, we've been talking about all this, but I do think at a certain point, we do have to bite the bullet and just start doing that thing that any conversation about old comedies turns into, which is just gleefully discussing bits. Because this movie invites it. This movie contains This movie contains, I would argue, Chico's, at the very least, most famous joke, and I would say perhaps his greatest joke, which is one of the greatest payoffs of all time. You can't fool me, there ain't no Sanity Claus.
I was going to say, that's
one of the most iconic
jokes. I was dying at the bit when the cop comes to the apartment and they keep going in and out, taking out the mattresses. It's like, oh, what are you going to tell me? There wasn't 4 mattresses there?
Hey, you!
What's wrong with me? You're going to tell me there's only 2 mattresses here? Which answer do you want first? Just like, and then just running around taking them out.
How do those 2 mattresses get in here? Well, you know how those 2 things are. When they go at it, they go at it. Like, it's so great.
And then Harpo making himself the door. Oh.
Harpo makes himself the door, and then they get dressed up, and then Harpo and Chico become a rocking chair, and it's just like, oh, I'm sorry, I guess I came into the wrong part. I was dying at that bit. That shit fucking
That's one of my favorite bits. The stateroom bit and that are so good. I that's one of those things where it's like you look at the cop bit and it's like that has a very clear comedic pivot where it's just like it's the cop saying hey you. It always goes back to that and it just keeps like getting more. It's like hey you gotta tell me what's going on right now. It's like, oh well, there's that's a 2-pronged question. Like let's just go.
And there's a hunt. It's Groucho. There's 1,000 things, and I'm not even gonna remember everything. I could go to the IMDb page, quotes page, and just read. But one that just stuck with me and killed me was, "Hey, you got 2 5s? Yeah, I do. Well, then you don't need the 10 cents I was going to give you."
Yes. Well, no, one of my favorites.
I love the moment. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say one of my favorites early on is you pay him $1,000 for singing. For 75 cents, I could get a record of Minnie the Moocher. For $1.25, I could have Minnie.
That's the best. I love that too. That's a great joke. I also loved when they're in the hotel room. I think before the cop shows up, they're having breakfast, and they're it's just a scene with bits at breakfast. Harpo like blows up his glove and then starts like milking it like they're udders, and Groucho just says, I've been looking forward to this breakfast for a while. I've been looking forward to this breakfast for a long time. It's so funny, just like all these.
The bit when they're on the ship and they're ordering food.
Oh, well, yeah.
And 2 hard-boiled eggs.
2 hard-boiled eggs. That's the same thing with
make that 3 hard-boiled eggs. It's
the same thing.
If I'm doing my math correctly, 12 hard-boiled eggs.
And it's like it really is the repetition of it because each one of them has the distinct thing. So it's Chico doing and the 2 hard-boiled eggs and 2 hard-boiled eggs. Honk, make that 3 hard-boiled eggs. And this and that, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. 2 hard-boiled eggs. Honk, make that 3 hard-boiled eggs. It's just, it keeps working.
And then I want 2 pancakes, 6 pieces of bacon, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. Yeah, it's so great.
I saw Miss Claypool first. Of course, her mother really saw her first, but there's no point in bringing up the Civil War into this. I mean, it's literally just that's the thing. It's why I say, like, really the only negative I could give this movie is the non-Marx stuff, because everything Groucho says is top tier. Everything Harpo does is fucking top tier. Everything Chico does is top tier. Zeppo's not in the movie. So, like, you really just got one moment perfect fucking movie here.
Well, and
one moment I remember that's been burned in my head that almost feels anachronistic to when this movie came out, but I remember so clearly because this is a moment that when my father showed me this movie when I was very young, and we've since seen it together several times. Every time we put it on, he laughs very hard at the moment I'm about to describe. When they're watching the opera, and there's a moment in the show when a peasant woman has her solo, and she looks like rough. She's very made up to look very frightening looking. And Groucho just goes, "Boogie, boogie, boogie." It's almost like, it feels like that's a joke that from another time period, not in Like it almost feels more contemporary
It
of a
also,
moment for him to do that.
but it also pays off kind of the promise of the movie in a way, because up until this point, remember, all of the Marx Brothers movies have had generic titles, right? They've had Duck Soup,
Mhm.
Animal Crackers, Horse Feathers. By calling this one A Night at the Opera, it kind of sets the audience up the same way of something we're very used to now, or I guess we were in like 80s and 90s comedies, which is calling it A Night at the Opera is almost akin to like calling it Beverly Hills Cop or Rodney
Yes, yeah.
Dangerfield
Oh
Back to
god,
School, where the
yeah.
selling point to the audience is you know who this is, you know that they are funny. What we're going to tell you is the setting where they're going to fuck shit up, right? And when you call the movie A Night at the Opera, the promise to the audience is opera is very stuffy. The Marx Brothers are going to fuck with that. And so that little bit of Groucho reacting to a real opera going boogity boogity feels like kind of a payoff to what the movie actually doesn't do a lot. The movie has more respect for opera than you would think going in. But this is like one little moment where it's, I mean, more than you would expect from like,
Well, it's more disrespectful to the kinds of people that go to the opera than the opera
Sure.
itself. Because,
But I will say there is also a great joke early on that where Groucho's being driven by carriage around the theater, and it's just like, "Is it over yet?" It's like, no, "You didn't miss it yet, Mister Driftwood." Is like, I told you to slow down that horse.
Yeah.
Now you almost made me hear the opera.
Yes. Which, that's the thing. I was gonna say one of the bits that I love, because the more you watch these movies, the more you pick up on kind of the smaller jokes that Groucho has, right? That maybe don't land the first time. Like the big climax when the ship is taking off, right? And Groucho walks up and goes, "Do I still have time to pay my hotel bill?" "No, sir. I'm sorry. There's no time." "Suits me fine," and runs off.
Fine.
It's like it's not this movie, but like I said, I had Animal Crackers on, and there's one quick bit that killed me. He's talking to Margaret Dumont. He's got a cigar in his hand, and he goes, "Do you mind if I don't smoke?" And she goes, "Sure." And he just puts the cigar in his pocket. And it's just...
And I think I think I want to clear up also some Margaret Dumont misinformation that's been around for a while. I've been thinking about this a lot because like Groucho is famous for like saying that Margaret Dumont didn't have a sense of humor or didn't understand the jokes that were being fed to, like, and I'm just going to say, I think that's, as an actor of her caliber, impossible to say. Like, I think like she had a firm grasp of what was going on, and she played her part very well. And you can argue that she's one of like that she's the fifth Marx Brothers in considering that Gummo didn't do movies. Of like, she's part of the crew. She knows the patter. She understands because I know that's like a big point of contention now, is to dispel that of just like, well, actually, like, she's a really competent comedic actress.
One thing that I heard asserted, and I don't know how true this is, right? But it's something I'm inclined to believe, which is that this conception that is now tossed around that, oh, Margaret Dumont didn't understand what was funny, right? That she didn't know what was funny. In the same way that, like, the true story of when the guy who was recording the Blazing Saddles theme was singing it, he didn't know the movie was a comedy, right? And he just
right.
My favorite
the thing that I heard that I and again, I can't verify this, but I would be inclined to believe is that perhaps the germ of truth that this originates with is that Margaret Dumont was the kind of person where she couldn't come up with jokes, right? She wasn't like a funny person, but that if you told her like, hey, this is the scene, this is the bit, she had good comedic timing.
Of course, because she's a good actress. She understands the material that's been given to her.
Well, yeah, but I mean it in terms of like there are
there's just like a lot of very good, competent actors that are great in comedy, or when you actually talk to them, are not like Robin Williams doing riffs all the time. They're not that kind of, that their brains work that way.
But there are also great actors who
Yeah.
cannot land comedic timing. And I think
Sure.
what, again, something I heard posited was that like the germ of truth of it in a way, right, was that over time, like this story that got told of, rather it was the case of like, again, that Margaret Dumont was understood her comedic timing, but did not necessarily have the patience to kind of fuck around and do bits on set. You know what I mean?
Sure,
Like,
no.
and I'm sure you've.
She's not riffing, no.
That's the thing. I'm sure you've dealt with this, David. I mean, you come from an improv background, and you come from like an improv comedy background, and very clearly, when you do things with those people, right? When you are around, if you've got like 3 improvisers in a room, they're gonna do bits for like a long stretch of time. And if you have 3 improvisers and an actor who is not an improviser in a room, that actor is not an improviser is going to hit a certain point where they're like, can we just fucking 5 minutes? I bring this up because
a comedian's energy classically puts people, it's off-putting to most people. It's off-putting to people who aren't regularly in that world, who are like who have their own shit going on. They have their own process to work with. It's like, I've met many like, I know a lot of people who are like trained classically in theater who have been in comedic productions that they kill, but when you talk to them as a person, they are extremely dedicated. They're an extremely dedicated, like Juilliard trained actor, let's say. Like, it's very like, they're very, and they're who don't naturally like necessarily are able to riff or improvise or like add on. They're more about the text, and they're working from a place of like, well, how does this moment fit? And like, and they're like, and Margaret Dumont is like a very, she's again one of these characters. Like, I look at like, you look at the supporting characters in these classic comedy spaces. I think also of this guy Bud Jameson, who is in a lot of Three Stooges content, and he's like he similar to Dumont is always got cast as like, the upper crusty guys. If the Stooges he's like the, I mean, he plays the lawyer in the best Stooges short that I've seen, which is the one in the courtroom. And he is like a similarly, like, not necessarily a comedian, was a really good actor, had a really commanding presence, and the type of person that is good to be a foil for a comic. Like, he's like, and Margaret Dumont is like, was almost like, that's the type of actress she is. She is the perfect, like, she like represents dignified, quote unquote, dignified class.
Yeah.
Well, isn't kind of the best example of today of amazing actor with uncanny comic timing, but is not actually themselves funny, is Alec Baldwin? Like, isn't that kind of just like the perfect example of that?
It's funny you said that, because I was thinking about SNL in that way, that like when you hear about like the great hosts, they tend to split them in 2 camps, right?
Yeah.
They never talk about a great host being somebody that comes in and like necessarily pitches sketches. They tend to hate when somebody comes in and goes, I got an idea for a funny bit. Like Steven Seagal did that infamously. Donald Trump did that infamously. It was just like, I got an idea for a funny sketch. And it's usually, I sexually harass women. That's usually their pitch. But they either talk about people who like show up on day one and are like playing improv games with the cast like it's theater school, or they'll talk about people who show up and are like, you tell me what sketches you need me to do, you tell me what you want me to do. Like Baldwin, Tom, like you said, is a great example, because Canteen Boy, as an example, is like the kind of thing that like somebody who was an improviser, right? Somebody who was a let's play theater games from day one can't make Canteen Boy work, because they will be trying to make a character, right? They will be trying to land the, come up with like, well, what could make this bit better? Whereas Canteen Boy works because Baldwin is just like, okay, you have told me that I need to play this character, you know, like I am in, like I am in a 50s melodrama, right? Like that's
Right,
what you've told me. You've told me I need to play Canteen Boy like I am in All That Heaven Allows. And so his only modus operandi is play the Scoutmaster and Canteen Boy like All That Heaven Allows. He's not interested in adding extra shtick, and it works. And I think Margaret Dumont is a similar thing, right? Where she is meant to play the, like, she understands exactly what she needs to give for Groucho to hit a home run.
Right.
She's not interested in like she's not interested in scoring any points herself. You know, she's given him what he needs.
Now, I might be mixing up my movies again, but was it this movie? Is it Night in the Opera? I just saw this. I always get this joke confused, but there's a great. Groucho and Dumont have such a great rapport with each other, and there's so many strings of funny jokes and dialogue between them. But like one of my favorite exchanges is when she's like talking about her dead husband, and just like, I held him in my arms and I kissed him. Oh, I see. So it was murder.
I don't believe that.
Very much like that is such like good pitter patter between the two of them, which is like one of the things was like I think like, you know, some people might have like a contentious opinion about like putting Marx Brothers movies in the screwball comedy category because they are technically like they're so much their own thing that they are sort of separate from like a Preston Sturges comedy. But I disagree with that distinction only because the patter is similar and it's all about the rhythm.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting is that because I think the Last Testament to Dumont, I'll say, is there's, again, I'm bringing up a different film, but with Animal Crackers, there is an extended sequence where Groucho proposes a polygamous marriage, right? Between him, Dumont, and the other woman in the scene. And she plays into that so well, and she does that so well. And that's also, again, one of my favorite bits from any Marx Brothers thing. And this ties back to up top, Tom, an hour ago, you were talking about like lowbrow comedy. You're like, you know, Woody Allen isn't doing stuff like this. And yet Woody Allen is, you know...
He has his moments where he does shit like this.
He thinks he Groucho Marx is God to him, right? Like in Manhattan, when he's doing the list of like things that make life worth living, he says Groucho Marx. And in Animal Crackers, there's a bit that's very early Woody Allen, like Love and Death Woody Allen, which is Groucho going, and excuse me, I'm going to have a strange interlude. And then he steps forward and starts doing this like Eugene O'Neill monologue. And Dumont has to stay frozen in place. And I know that seems easy for people who have never done any kind of performing. And I'm not pretending to be a performer, but I did, you know, theater in high school and college, and standing in place convincingly is tough enough. And somehow she manages to be funny doing it.
And with serious actors, they focus a lot more on like, well, what is my motivation for why am I doing this? Like, what is the logical place I can get myself so I can really like make this performance convincing? And especially like in the 30s, if you're telling an actor, it's like, okay, this person's going to break form and like penetrate the fourth wall and like talk to the audience, you have to stand there and just pretend like you're frozen in time. It's just like, wait a second, that's like such a high concept thing to process. It's like you really have to do work, and she's a pro.
I want to address, and obviously, like, you know, we can talk a bit more. We should probably give some time to the contract scene, if just because we'll get yelled at otherwise.
Okay, let's talk about the contract scene. Yeah.
Well, right before we do, one thing I want to touch on because I want to make sure we didn't forget. There's 2 songs in this movie. The one that we alluded to is Alone, which, and Tom, especially to you, I'll direct this, even though this is calling back to a season 1 movie, so you're going to say you don't remember. Did you clock who wrote the song Alone in the opening credits?
No.
The name on that is Arthur Freed,
Right. Yes.
the namesake for the famed Freed unit at MGM. Arthur Freed wrote a number of songs for MGM for all of their musicals, and of course, when the 50s rolls around, he put a bunch of those songs that he wrote for MGM into
Mhm.
Singin' in the Rain, which we covered on the first season of our show.
Hell yeah.
Now, for eagle-eared viewers, a song that later appears in Singin' in the
Listeners.
Rain is in A Night at the Opera,
Mhm.
which is when Chico plays the piano.
Right.
He's playing
Right.
that da 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 da
All
da
I
da
do the whole
da
night through
is
is think
free.
of you.
Yes,
Diddly-doo. Yeah.
which is what the chorus girls are singing in Singin' in the Rain.
Which is
So
the way they sing that song and Singing in the Rain is the tempo that song is
God, I need
normally
to.
sung in songs.
yeah,
Where
I need
I
to rewatch
actually
that movie,
prefer
man.
this really like slow melodic
Mhm.
piano. And then the way Chico Marx plays piano is my favorite piano playing I've ever seen. It's almost like he's doing it. It's not almost. He is doing it comically. He's doing bits. He's like doing the pew pew fingers
yeah,
when he's like at the keys. He's like doing comic bits with his piano playing in a way that's so like to me that's always been the pinnacle of like elegant and cool of just like well I can play the piano funny and it's like actually sounds really good and I'm self-taught and it's like I can like do pew pew fingers and it still make a note on these keys is always like that's something I've always been very impressed by.
Well, that's the thing too. Is Chico and Harpo are self-taught, and the story goes that Harpo self-taught on the harp, and when he finally got around to seeing people play the harp for real, he went, "Oh, I'm doing it wrong. I
Which
learned
is
to do
insane. Which is
everything
so
wrong."
funny to think about, like a poor Jewish kid in the Bronx, like trying to learn how to play the harp, the most notorious, like hard to carry and own instrument. Where it's just like there's never been a big enough space in a New York apartment to store a harp. They're giant and they're brass and they're delicate.
So let's take a moment, just because again, Marx Brothers fans are intense. We have to acknowledge the contract scene is one of the all-time great Marx Brothers scenes, and it's such a simple bit at its core. And I mean, I should say it's the most famous. It's also, I grew up with a lawyer as a father. Like,
Mm-hmm.
The contract scene in the Marx Brothers and the famed Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, a law firm name are like the two jokes that every lawyer knows by heart.
Yes.
They come up so often. And that contract sequence just is one of the I can't hear, even in serious conversation, I can't hear the party of the first part without thinking of this bit now.
It's fully a part of the ingrained in that language now. Of just like yeah, you could. It's one of those things like I'm sure like in law school, someone plays that scene for a class to be like, well, this is like the most famous contract scene in all of cinema history. You have to know why this is funny, and just like all the like, and they do that thing that I love doing in improv myself when by the time they just start getting to when they just start like ripping off parts of the contract and just like okay the party of the fourth part let's skip that
Yes.
already just like that's the thing that's in it when I do improv I love to if the scene starts to get like clearly the best part of the scene is just listing something I'm always of the mindset of just like hey, you know what you should do? Let's list 6 more things and then just like go down and just like do more bits is just like always a prime choice.
Well, and one thing I'll say too is, you often hear about like, because this is a film, but that contract sequence is a sketch, right?
Yes.
And you often hear about
100%.
how hard it is to end sketches. And it's why Monty Python never ended sketches, things like that. The fact that they have a great ending to it, they have a great punchline, and then a second punchline in the broader story of the movie, insofar as you end the contract exchange with the great bit of, hey, sign your name. I don't know how to write. That's fine. This pen doesn't have ink. That kind of bit. And then but then you pull back to the broader film and you remember this entire scene took place while they are standing on top of an unconscious man.
Yeah.
Which, because the camera pushes in, it's one of those little visual gags. Because, if you had seen this on stage, presumably they would have just been standing on the man the whole time. And the absurdity of that is present the whole time. But because we've zoomed in and then we pull back out, you get the extra punchline of us going, oh, that's right. That's where this started.
There are so many great guys getting conked on the head in this movie that, I mean, just as a never-ending 12-year-old and a 34-year-old man's overly hairy body just really struck a chord with me. It's just like, yeah, we just need to clonk guys in the head more with mallets and whatever large items we can find. It's just some top-tier clonking in this movie. It's a technical term.
So, as we wind down, I have to say
also,
we would... Yeah.
They did not like the director of this movie.
Yeah, they didn't have a good relationship with Sam Wood. They were really frustrated with him.
He had no idea how to work with them. He had no idea how to really work on comedy. He shot 20 takes for everything. He didn't know how to basically direct them. He would just say, I don't know, do it again, and kind of try to figure it out when they saw the dailies, what worked, drove them crazy, which just adds to the, like, there's no right way or easy way to make a great movie, because, like, the director was I'll say it, I'm brave enough. The man's dead. He was a dipshit. He didn't know what he was doing. He was kind of just thrown in as a journeyman guy for Thalberg. But then you even got, like, the Thalberg stuff, I know how to make Marx Brothers make more money, and worked on this one, maybe didn't work on some of the other ones, but, like, it's something I wanted to mention before we got sidetracked. Back to this. It makes me just think about how, like, the state of the cinema that we're in now, where you absolutely cannot trust an executive when it comes to a creative note at all, because at least back then, those guys may have been dumbasses in many respects. They at least were trying to make the best movie possible. And sometimes, like you said, the stateroom scene, he knew, like, no, this is a scene that can only work on camera because the camera's going to make it dynamic and make it work. So there's something there. We now live in an era where execs, all they care about is, well, is it going to be another Get Out? Okay, do that. Yeah. Get that. Is it going to be another The Menu? All right, give Ayo Edebiri that money for another The Menu. I'm
sure they were thinking about that. I'm sure they were thinking about those things back then too. Without a doubt. Yeah. But you're right. The values are different. They back then were thinking of, like, trying to make the best movie they could, because that was their product.
Well, because you wouldn't have Thalberg have them test out the material across the country to make the best bits for the movie today. Like, they're not doing that. The most they do today is run a test screen. If it doesn't work, go back and we'll do some ADR jokes, or maybe have a different ending where, like, I don't know, somebody farts and, like, everybody's happy.
But that's and can he plank? Can the Marx Brothers plank in this movie?
But part of that, though, is the fact that, honestly, what's driving them to make sure these films are quality back in that day, beyond profit, I mean, yeah, they're profit-minded, but they're also pride-minded, right? And
Mikey cut out a little bit.
Okay, sorry. They're profit-minded, but they're also prideful. The role of the producer and the studio head is not what it is now, because there weren't these multimedia conglomerates. We've had modern versions of it. I'm going to evoke some not great people when I say this, but, like, Robert Evans and Harvey Weinstein are examples of guys who, like, they saw these movies as, like, their name was attached, and they're like, and that means I am going to say I'm the reason this was good. And there
Right.
were movies that all of these studio heads, the Thalberg and Selznick and all of these guys, they didn't care as much about the box office so much as they cared about showing the other studio heads, hey, I made this picture, right? Like that
Right,
picture,
yeah.
this movie that you told me, hey, everybody said Gone with the Wind couldn't be made. I made fucking Gone with the Wind, right? I made Gone with the Wind. Robert Evans, in the 70s, everybody says you can't make gangster pictures anymore. I made the gangster picture. I picked that director. I did this. I did that. And so I think when it comes to Thalberg, this whole partnership, the genesis of it was he was looking at it and going, why can't somebody get the Marx Brothers to work? I know how to get the Marx Brothers to work. So for him, getting involved in that on a creative level wasn't just about like profit margins or shareholders, but it was also just the pride of being able to go, I made this work. I think for a long time, there was this mentality amongst artists that you don't want the money men to also be artists. And I think what we've seen in the last 10, 20 years is how wrong that is. Because as much as annoying as it is when the money men also want to sit down and like talk about the script with you, it is so much worse when they don't care about the script. They only care about the algorithm.
Yeah.
You look at a classic example. I'm going to get Michael Eisner. When he took over the Walt Disney Company, Michael Eisner went to school for playwriting. Michael Eisner viewed himself as a creative, and that didn't mean that he was sitting down and writing the scripts to Down and Out in Beverly Hills or anything. But
he understood story structure, and he understood and like when he was taking over Disney and created the Touchstone arm of that company, that's because those are the types of movies he liked.
Yeah.
And also, that was also so much longer ago than we think. Like we're now we're now so far afield of that we are now in an era where Disney is trying to chase the highs that they hit in 2018 and 2019 when Bob Iger kind of had an almost like I don't want to say hands-off approach, but I'm going to hire the best people and give them the space they need, and if they need help, I will help them. As we all know, he had to fight very hard with Black Panther to get that movie made, and he's very proud of it, but he's never going to come out and say, I was a creative force. But now we are now in an era post-Chapek where Iger is back, and it's been long enough for Iger to be back that he's now doing the algorithmic stuff. Disney has not written the ship. We are now still stuck in everything is not tanking maybe box office wise, but nobody's really caring about these movies. They're kind of just things that are happening. Star Wars is on the ropes. Marvel is kind of a joke at this point. There's a new Captain America movie next week. Who the fuck knows that it's coming out or even cares about it? It's next week.
Fantastic Four is coming out in July.
So like we're now in an era where other than a Jason Blum who will straight up just be like, here, you guys do what you want. And I will give you help if you need it. I have some sort of ideas, but whatever. We are now so stuck in a realm where, like Mike said, there was an era where execs could at least have the sense to try to help because they had the pride to try to help. Now we're we've got the algorithm, we've got our streaming services, and most importantly, we have stockholders.
That's the thing.
And we need the stockholders to be happy. And the stockholders are not going to be happy when they see 700,000 people have unsubscribed from Disney Plus in the quarter one. So but it's just this ultimate thing of like, as much as, the guys back then weren't perfect. Shady business practices, fucked over artists, left, right, and center, what have you. But when you look at the actual end product art that was being made, at the end of the day, you could at least say these shyster fucks that were clearly only wanted money, there was still an element of, at least we want to steal money from artists off of good projects instead of dog shit nobody remembers.
And on that note, winding down as we always do, Tom.
0.
You gotta wait for me to say it.
No, I
How
don't.
do you, as I remind you, Tom, some people are listening for the first time. They don't know what I'm asking.
Well, that's their fault. They've hit such a rock bottom in their life.
So, Tom, winding down as we always do, how do you think A Night at the Opera fared at the Academy Awards that year?
0.
That is true. The Best Picture nominees that year, for context, were Alice Adams, Broadway Melody of 1936, Captain Blood, David Copperfield, The Informer, The Lives of a Bengal Lancer, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Les Miserables, Naughty Marietta, Ruggles of Red Gap, Top Hat, which we've covered on the show, and the winner that year, Mutiny on the Bounty. Now,
Oh, wow.
all of those were nominated for Best Picture and not Night at the Opera, but as a counterpoint, none of those titles became the greatest album ever recorded by the band Queen. So, which is the higher honor?
At the end of the day, who wins? But also,
Right?
Captain Blood is a great title.
That
That sounds like a fucking King Diamond song.
I love Captain Blood. Like, that's an Errol Flynn swashbuckler, like Captain Blood, Seahawk.
Oh, yeah.
As I was just texting you about earlier today, Tom, Santa Fe Trail, another great Errol Flynn with the
How
weirdest
many
cast.
nominees was that?
That was probably 10, right? 1,
10.
2, 3,
They had
4,
10 back then, too.
8, 9, 10, 11. Wait, hang on. I can't be counted. 1, 2, 3, 4.
It sounded like more than 10 when you were listing them.
10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, wow, 13.
13.
They were very
Wow, that's
willy-nilly with that.
crazy.
I'm pretty sure, I think 1942, Casablanca is the last year before they go to 5.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's
Strong
crazy
line.
that it almost feels like an unfair standard because the number changes all the time. Because now it's 7?
No, it's 10.
This
Well,
year's 10.
well, isn't it now still that tenuous?
No,
depending on the votes.
So what it was for a period of time when they first switched it back to 10 after 2008. The thing they were saying was, well, it's based on votes, so it could be anywhere from 5 to 10. And then what ended up happening is, like, you had a couple years where, like, stuff didn't make the cut or did make the cut. And it was this weird thing where they're like, no, we're going to reform it. It's guaranteed to be 10 every year.
Okay.
Because you were getting into a situation where there were a lot of questions like, well, why the fuck didn't this one make the cut? Well, it didn't get enough first place votes. Okay, but it got, like, the most second place votes. And that's, it was a weird thing where, like, you couldn't really swing that. Anyway, that was that year in cinema. David, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
And
as usual,
thank you for, in recording order, becoming our first ever 5-timer, which is, again, I hate to say it this way. I don't mean to, but it's very weird that I've started, that I have this podcast that we came up with during COVID, and one of the most frequent guests is a man I watched on television a lot. That's very crazy to me. That's every once in a while I have to remind myself of that and how strange that is in a way,
And I feel like there is a handful of stuff next year that could very well capture your eye.
Oh yeah.
And I won't venture a guess on what you would end up picking.
No, because we got it wrong the last time.
Well, because we got it wrong, and then next year I'm going to forget that I made the prediction. So there's a bunch of stuff that I do foresee you maybe wanting to continue in this vein, maybe go back to the old vein of us talking about, crusty old men and crime dramas and what for. There's some other stuff that would be,
Or this would be a great time for David to reveal he can't stand us.
No.
5 years worth of this show, but is like, I gotta tell you, not a fan.
That's usually how long people take to finally have enough of me, so that would make sense.
No, not at all, fellas. I love coming on this show. I love talking about movies with you guys. It's always a blast. It's so much fun. You guys always give good choices and it's hard to choose, and then we end up having a fun conversation. And I love it. I love listening to the show.
Oh, it's so nice. We love having you on.
Thank you, buddy.
But now, tell folks about what you're doing when you're not on the show. Plug everything you've got to plug.
I've got a Substack where I write about movies called There Will Be Bluvband. You can find it online. Every week I update it and I write about a different movie that I want them generally recommending to people, or sometimes I'll do like different profiles of actors. I wrote up something about Laird Krieger a couple of weeks ago that was fun to research. I did like a Peter Lorre series, which was fun. And on February 24th, I have a one-man show at UCB that I'm auditioning, called David Bluvband is the Movie, and it's a partially improvised, partially scripted, improvised one-man movie that I'm going to construct with the help of the audience, and that's it.
I mean, I'll say this. I think that's something that I really hope I have the opportunity to check out, and I will also say, David, for your sake, I'm going to make sure Tom does not check that out, because you said you're getting help from the audience, and you've done this show 5 years. Be honest, is that somebody you want to have the power to yell suggestions from the crowd? Be real. Let's be real.
From the amount of audience interaction that is actually involved with this show, more than your average improv show you might see. Tom, you're always invited. I'll never say don't come, but I will say keep in mind I have to perform whatever you suggest. that would do me dirty.
I'm just
the Nuremberg trials.
I was going to say, I'm just imagining David going, all right, now to start, I need a location. And from the back, you just hear, do George C. Scott in hardcore. It's not even really.
That's all. You don't have to ask me to do that twice. I love to be like, that's my daughter. That's my daughter in that movie.
Tom just derails the show by just by just yelling like lesser known B movies to you, and you just doing the impressions. You forget to do the show.
If that's what it is, then please come yell as much as you want. You could be the second man in the show. That'd be great.
All right, guys. Now I need an occupation. Charles Bronson in 10 to Midnight. It's just
God.
Oh no!
This is for jacking off, isn't it?
Oh. That's not from
10
This is
for jacking off, isn't it? You do this, right?
Oh, wait, that's from 10 to Midnight. Kinjite is the really crazy one. No, that's from... Yeah, wait, I forget.
No, 10 to Midnight is the... 10 to Midnight is the... It's for jacking off.
It's the jacking off one. Yeah, Kinjite is the one that starts with him raping someone.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, he's the bad guy in Kinjite.
Well, that's the thing. No, he's not. But that's for another time.
Okay. Well, now we know your next one-man show, which is David Bluvband recreates scenes from Tom's Blu-ray shelf.
Yeah.
I need a location. Little Germany and Argentina.
David, thank you so much for coming on. We can't wait to have you back. This was such a delight. And
thanks for having me, guys.
Always a pleasure.
And welcome to the Five Timers Club.
Yeah. I can't wait to get that gold jacket.
But everybody else, stick around.
Mike, get on that.
Everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do at the end of each episode is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
So for me, this one kind of came in a flash. There was a little worry at first. I'm like, fuck, what am I going to pick? But then it came to me pretty quickly and in a flash of inspo. I mentioned it in the episode. This is the first, basically, or the first perfect snobs versus slobs movie. And it led me to picking maybe the best kind of example of that from the heyday of that, late 70s, early 80s, snobs versus slobs. Going with the kind of rickety structural thing where it's got the form and look of a movie, but does it actually have a script, and was it just shooting these comedians doing things and then just figuring it out as we went? Also having that feeling of having four distinct comedic voices clashing against each other and seeing what magic kind of happened. It's one of the iconic movies of that era. I think it's got some of the best performances from those guys in the movie. And while it may not be a perfect movie, it is perfectly emblematic of the movies of the time. I'm picking Caddyshack. It's essentially a Marx Brothers movie at a golf course. You know, Chevy, Bill, Rodney, Ted Knight, all filling the different comedic kinds of performers you can fit into a movie. Also, like A Night at the Opera, has this love story thing going on that you ultimately don't give a shit about. And the filmmakers didn't either, because they basically edited it out by the end of the movie, and it's not even important by the end of the movie. The movie's wildly funny, wildly uneven, just feels like anarchy in a 90-minute box, which feels perfect for a Marx Brothers companion piece. Snobs versus Slobs, Night at the Opera, and Caddyshack. I think it works. That's my pick. Go with God.
My pick will probably not be that surprising to anybody who just listened to the conversation we had, because I sure as hell referenced it a lot in that. On the one hand, it's kind of cool that the two Marx Brothers movies that are in the registry are Duck Soup, which was their last Paramount movie, and Night at the Opera, which is their first MGM. And that can feel pretty representative in and of itself. But the Marx Brothers had many great movies with a lot of great iconography. And even if you argue, and I think it's fair, to say, those two movies that they have in are like pound for pound the best. To me, the best Groucho sequence in any movie that they've done is Captain Spaulding in Animal Crackers. And it's tough because I love to watch Captain Spaulding, the Captain Spaulding number. Hooray for Captain Spaulding, the African Expo. I love to watch that sequence, and it's become a lot harder because now if you type Captain Spaulding into YouTube, you just get clips from Rob Zombie movies. Which also, it should be noted, it's insane that we went that whole episode and Tom did not find any opportunity to bring up the fact that Otis B. Driftwood in A Night at the Opera becomes a character in the Rob Zombie movies. I'm kind of surprised we didn't get there. But nevertheless, Captain Spaulding, of course, also a name for one of the characters in Rob Zombie's films. Animal Crackers is probably, besides Duck Soup, my favorite Marx Brothers film. It's so zany. It's so fun. There's so many great bits, and it's so daringly pre-code in a lot of ways. I think there's so much quintessential Marx Brothers in that film that, yeah, I mean, look, more Marx Brothers should be in the registry in general, right? Across the board, it should be more than two. These are formative foundational comedy figures, and I think if you're going to add another one, it needs to be Animal Crackers. It brings me such joy. I had it on before we recorded, and I was 6 years old again as he was singing "Hello, I Must Be Going." It's such a wonderful film, and I think it absolutely deserves a place in the National Film Registry. So Animal Crackers is my pick.
Next week,
Jordan Beck is here, this time to discuss Magical Maestro.
So but with Chuck Jones, there's a super thumbprint, and with Tex Avery in general, yes, there's obviously you can, if you don't exactly know the name Tex Avery, whatever, but you know what that horny wolf is, right? The Tex Avery style.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natali and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampar and edited by Mike Natali and Kyle Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. Because we don't watch you, you're watching us.